Hi friends, host Eric here, host of Talking with Famous People, and I am making a video today. It's basically a philosophy video, but specifically it's about particles and waves and personality type, human beings, agency, consciousness, etc. Fancy talk stuff. Everybody's favorite. Everybody loves fancy talk stuff. And today's fancy talk begins with two classes of things which one might call objecti and motienti, as I was trying to avoid nouns somehow, or like nouniness. So the thing is, basically, I'm talking about particles and waves. But what I'm really talking about are things that can be rendered into binaries and things that cannot. Things that have identities that don't require motion or dynamism, and things that do. So, okay, this is kind of like, first, let me just stress the following. What I am not hurling at you is quantum woo, okay? What I am trying to do is explain the way that any conversation about philosophical matters is predicated on rendering whatever it is we're talking about into particles. Words are a form of particle, they're a form of object. They are static, and once stated and recorded and put up there, they stay the same. They don't change, right? Our understanding of what the words mean might change, but the actual words stated don't. In contrast, meaning is something that has that functionality of, or has that quality or attribute of waviness, which is to say, it's not absolute. It's not rock solid, certain, doesn't change. It does change. And this is indicative of the fact that humanity, consciousness itself, exists in two modalities. One being a turn-based modality, which is that we act as though objects are static and will remain the same until the next turn is taken, right? And the other of which is experiential, which assumes everything's real time, and if you miss your moment, you miss your moment. Examples. So when we talk about objects of analysis in general, I'm saying when I discuss dynamism, I'm rendering it static to discuss it, necessarily. I have to, because I'm turning it into a word. And words have, if nothing else, stasis in that they never change after they've been built by some person, right? RTXP, what does that stand for? Oh, real time experiential. I went over that already. Okay. Patterns of behavior. So when we look at patterns of behavior, then we are rendering into an object something that is actually a repeating feature of a dynamic process. So if somebody periodically, as they move through life, they're normal, and then all of a sudden they freak out over nothing and throw a bunch of shit and storm off. And this happens every few months. Then you would say, you'd create an object to describe that phenomenon of repetition across time. And you'd say, oh, he's got periodic outburst syndrome or something, right? And that would be rendering into a particle what's fundamentally a feature of a wave, that it has peaks and troughs and stuff like that. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with noting features of a pattern and rendering them into a static object. But it's important to remember when we're discussing consciousness, personality type, people, and so forth. So the other thing is, when we're talking about people, we're talking about an object of analysis. When we're talking about people in general, it's just an object of analysis, although that object of analysis contains within it features of dynamism. In other words, we understand when we're talking about people in general as an object of analysis that people in general are agents who do things as well as just be. But whether or not something is viewed as a particle or a wave within that object of analysis depends on a party's perspective as well. So if I'm having a conflict with somebody and I'm not liking the way they're engaging with my objects, it may be because they're not engaging with them as objects. They're engaging in that moment as a wave, which is to say, They're only experiencing the dynamic fluid changes, and not noticing or not paying attention to or not attending the the updated static things. It would be as though if you were to look up and watch the moon move across the sky very slowly, you wouldn't notice and couldn't notice that gradually square rocks were appearing every once in a while behind you, because it would be out of your peripheral vision and all of your attention would be on trying to notice the moon moving. Such is the nature of people's communicative conflicts, which is, when I'm talking, I'm expecting everything and everyone to behave as though my words are objects with concrete, distinct meanings and that don't change, more or less. Over time, gradually, they'll change in terms of how people use words, but that more or less don't change, and to behave accordingly. That what's going on here is that there are rocks appearing on the field, and we need to deal with them and discuss them. But for somebody who doesn't like this approach or isn't fundamentally all about this approach, they may be busy watching the moon, and they just see me as this distraction behind them, making them stumble over random things while they're trying to watch the moon. So, from a dynamics perspective, my static changes are going to be things that need to be completed in their own node, and then that will somehow impact how the dynamic experience of living proceeds forward. Whereas for people who are of and about that static mode, then the dynamic world keeps disrupting my ability to influence the static objects, because it changes the status quo such that my static objects no longer have exactly the same relevance unless I wall them off within a very concrete frame. So all of human being and the differentiation between meow human and meow human can be understood in terms of these two modalities and the various expressions of them and various permutations or combinations of perspective and dynamism and stasis. So when you include perspective, you're talking about agent, subject, object. That is to say, because things either are or are being, which is to say, because they either function as an object or an experience, as a human being, we've got three angles of approach towards that. The first one is I'm observing an object that is, or a process that's being. The second is I'm engaged in putting an object that is, or in experiencing a process of being. And the third one would be I'm seeking to get an object that exists already, and or to turn from a static truth, the information therein, an emotional truth that says this is what it means to me personally, etc., etc. So in other words, we have an agent, subject, object relationship. And what ends up happening with cognitive functions is it's balanced. We've got two ways of functioning as subjects, which means we can deal with both stasis and dynamism as subjects, with both an action function like NE or SE, which is dealing with it statically, more or less, or a interface function, FETE, which is dealing with it dynamically, more or less. And what I mean by that is both SE and NE kinds of action presume that the action can be taken between other actions. Like if you're TE or FE, you're assuming there's no way to answer questions or know what to do or anything until I get my hands dirty, either by feeling out the people and what their mood is and what the attitude of the room is and whether it's being well perceived, or by looking at the actual guts of the system that I'm trying to figure out. One way or the other, it's an it's a reactive, interactive kind of subjectness. With SE and NE, it's an active, like plan then act kind of approach. So we can do that with both of those things. We can engage with objects and dynamism as subjects, and we need four functions to do it because there are two kinds of dynamic systems. That's to say, dynamic systems of social engagement and social hierarchy, and there are two kinds of social dynamics, social hierarchy, and then the logic of individual systems. Since not everything functions with a communicative logic, which is universal, but instead has its own logic, like the logic of a folding chair is different than the logic of a table, obviously. Human beings need to have some capacity to figure out how to engage with an object that has a logic to it, whatever kind of object that is, be it a system or a physical object, but that it's a particularist logic to itself. So those kind of dynamics are incorporated in the subject functions TE and FE, and the other kind of static subject functions are incorporated by NE and SE. And then you've got object functions. You've got to have the capacity to both have an active relationship with the acquiring of the correct objects, and you've got to have the right relationship with the experience of the meanings and impacts of those objects. And those are TI and FI. So if I ask you a question about whether you really love me and you say, well, sort of, that object means what it means, but it means what it means on an FI level that is very different than what it means on a TI level, right? Both those things are object functions because they seek to get information, get objects, and do processes of determination on them. So the takeaway here is that human beings are a combination of all the things that are necessary given that consciousness exists along with or in the larger field of this division between things that are static and things that are dynamic, okay? And that if you do the full articulation of it, what you'll discover is that because there are three perspectives of relationship to each of those expressions of reality, static and dynamic, that you end up with 8 cognitive functions. And you might say, but 3 times 2 is 6, Eric. Well, that's true. We're talking about permutations, and there are certain limitations, which is to say, it's possible for me to, foremost in life, put static objects on the external metaphysical field like I'm doing now. That's possible, but it's not possible to also have that as my default way of being and have as a default way of being to get other people's objects and analyze them for how juicy they make me feel. I can prioritize one, I can prioritize the other. I can't prioritize both because I got a finite number of hours in the day. And that's the sort of simple realities that underlie typology, right? And of course, being habituated towards or naturally inclined or driven or compelled or reflexively approaching life through one of these different modalities, either as a subject or an agent or an object getter, and either a turn-based or a dynamics-based frame of reference. Well, some of them are mutually exclusive to be partners of attention, as your first 2 functions are. You know, they're a combination of 2 modalities that work together well in order to allow you to do what you need to do to not be overwhelmed by the singularity of choice or the singularity of attention in a world that demands a multiplicity of approaches. So, anyway, there are some things about which we ultimately can't communicate, and some of those things, when we try to communicate about them, we get bogged down. And so it's like we can talk about our emotions to some extent, but at the end of the day, how what it feels like for me to feel sad and how sad I am compared to some other time, and whether or not I've got sadness mixed in with happiness, and whether or not they're about the same thing. None of those questions provide words as answers that are useful for anything, really. You can't justify things, it doesn't generalize out. It's like a pebble drops in a pond where the ripples just go one ripple and then just die out. Whereas the more universally static the matters being discussed, the more successful one is in incorporating the dynamism of whatever's being discussed into these static objects of analysis, as I'm trying to do now. And the more capable we are of successfully mapping things, even though a map is necessarily static. And that's ultimately what cognitive functions has done, is it's provided us a means to understand and incorporate the dynamism of human being into a static system with only a limited amount of sort of arbitrary lines drawn here or there or metaphor and stuff. It's the most concrete thing that we have in psychology for sure, and it's a pretty impressive bow around a box of philosophy that has struggled throughout its entire history to explain itself. And that's what cognitive functions allows us to do. The reason some people like me want to blather on about philosophy stuff like this is because they're an ENTP. And they're putting static objects on the metaphysical external field where they expect them to remain static and mean certain things. And to the extent that philosophy is failing over and over again, it's failing because it's not accounting for the fact that its own preference towards these sort of static objects is what's preventing it from seeing a more holistic and dynamic view of reality. So I hope you enjoyed that video. Hopefully it wasn't too fancy talky or confusing or something, but I don't know. Felt like making it. Thought it would be good. Thanks for watching again. Bye.